if you really want to understand the long, complex history of the Levant, you've got to start by understanding the land itself. I mean, more than almost anywhere else on Earth, the story of this place was written right into its rocks, its mountains, and its valleys, long before people ever showed up. And today, that's the blueprint we're going to read together.
Okay, just look at this map for a second. This tiny little sliver of land is where Africa, Asia, and Europe all collide. It's a land bridge, right? An unavoidable corridor that's squeezed between the massive Mediterranean Sea on one side and the even more massive Arabian Desert on the other. For thousands of years, if you were an army, a trader, a nomad, anyone trying to get between these continents, you had to pass through here. There was literally no other way to go.
So, let's start with that big picture. We're not just looking at a piece of land. We're looking at what was basically the most important crossroads in the entire ancient world. And its status, its importance, was all dictated by its geography.
Now, what's so wild about this is how these huge natural barriers basically act like a giant funnel. You've got mountains to the north, this forbidding desert to the east and south, and of course the sea to the west. And all of them work together to channel human movement directly into this one single narrow strip of land. It's a geographic bottleneck on a continental scale.
And when I say narrow, just how narrow are we talking about? Well, the main area where people actually lived, from Dan up in the north down to Beersheba in the south, is only about 110 miles long. That's shorter than the drive from New York City to Philadelphia. Into this incredibly tiny space is packed an almost unbelievable amount of history, and it's all because of where it is.
All right, so now let's zoom in a bit from that global view and take a look at the internal structure of the land itself. Because if you really want to read the blueprint of the Levant, you have to look underground.
The first thing you notice, the most obvious feature, is that the entire region is basically organized into 4 parallel strips that run north to south, kind of like lanes on a highway. And this pattern, this is the single most important feature of its physical geography. It dictates absolutely everything that comes after.
So here they are. First, right up against the Mediterranean, you have the flat, fertile coastal plains. Then, as you move inland, bam, you immediately hit the western highlands. This is the hill country in the mountains. Keep going east, and the land just plummets down into this deep central rift valley where you find the Jordan River. And then finally, on the other side, it rises back up to the huge eastern plateau. So you have to ask, what could possibly create these 4 perfect zones? Well, the answer is a massive system of geological faults. This right here, this is the actual blueprint. You can see the main fault lines running straight up the map. These are deep cracks in the Earth's crust that, over millions of years, pushed up the highlands on either side and caused the land in the middle to just drop, creating that dramatic rift valley. This tectonic action is the architect of the entire landscape.
Okay, so geology gives us the structure, the bones of the land, so to speak. But what actually brings it to life? Well, the answer, as it is so often, is water. And specifically, how that water gets spread across this very unique landscape. We have these 4 distinct zones, right? But they are not created equal. Not by a long shot. The geology set the stage, but it's the climate that decides where the action is going to happen. So, where can people actually live? Where can they form and build cities and thrive? And the answer is completely determined by those western highlands we talked about. They act like a giant wall. All the wet winter storms rolling in from the Mediterranean Sea smack right into these mountains and are forced to go up. As that moist air rises, it cools and it drops all its water as rain, soaking the western slopes. But by the time those clouds make it over the mountains, they're pretty much empty. This creates a dry rain shadow over the Rift Valley and the plateau to the east.
And this chart just shows you how incredibly dramatic that effect is. I mean, the Lebanon mountains can get over 48 inches of rain a year, a ton of water. But just a few dozen miles to the east, in that central valley, that number gets cut in half, down to 23 inches. And by the time you get to a city like Damascus on the eastern plateau, you're looking at less than 8 inches. It's an absolutely stark climatic divide, and it's all because of that wall of mountains.
So, we've got the geology, we've got the climate. Now it's time for the final, and honestly the most important step, connecting this physical blueprint to the human story. How did this landscape end up shaping everything from trade and conflict to where people even decided to live? And this is the real payoff. On the left, you see those geological fault lines from before. On the right, you see the major ancient travel routes, and it's an almost perfect match. The big international highways didn't try to cut across the difficult mountains, of course not. They followed the path of least resistance, along the flat coastal plain and down that long straight line of the Rift Valley and the Eastern Plateau. Geography didn't just suggest the way, it demanded it. So here's the crucial takeaway.
Those easy north-south routes became the great international highways, connecting massive empires like Egypt and Mesopotamia. But trying to move east to west against the grain of the land was so much harder. You were limited to just a few really difficult mountain passes. And what this did was it isolated communities from each other, creating all these distinct local cultures while the great powers were busy fighting for control of the main corridors.
But what about all those places that the highways avoided? You know, the tangled mountains, the harsh deserts, the impassable marshes. These regions of difficulty, as they're called, served an equally important, though very different role in the story of the Levant.
To really get these places, we need a better word than just desert. The biblical Hebrew term is midbar, and it doesn't just mean sand and dunes. It means any kind of untamed land that you just couldn't farm. Rugged hills, rocky plateaus, dense thickets. It's the wild, uncontrolled space.
So what was the historical purpose of the Midbar? Well, it was a refuge. While huge empires were battling it out for the fertile plains and the strategic highways, these regions of difficulty became sanctuaries for dissidents, for rebels, for fugitives. They were the places you could run to when you needed to escape the reach of a central government. They were zones of freedom and resistance, carved out by the harshness of the land itself.
So you see, from the continental funnel down to the deep fault lines, from the rain shadow to the paths of refuge, the physical landscape of the Levant has always been an active character in its human drama. It set the stage, it drew the maps for trade and for war, and it offered sanctuary to those who needed it. So the question this all leaves us with is this: is geography destiny? In this ancient land, it comes closer than just about anywhere else.